So we're in part 2 of our series, What Makes You Happy? And if you were here last week, hopefully you know the answer to this question. What makes you happy? There you go, excellent. No thing. What makes you happy? No thing. Last week we talked about the place that things have or objects have in our life, and actually they are something that doesn't make us happy. As we kicked off this series last week, we saw that happiness is more about a who than it is about a what. You know, at the end of your life, you're going to want to spend time with a bunch of who's, not a bunch of whats. You're not going to want to spend time with your golf clubs or your phone or your handbag or your car. It's people that you're going to want to make peace with. But there's the whole thing about this, and we spent ages talking about this, and we realized, things don't make us happy. You know, happiness is deeper than that. There's something about what's in our happiness that we still go after them, that we still focus our time and our energy on them, that we still try and fill our lives or find happiness in a bunch of what's. And why do we do that? Well, the reason we do that is because it works. And I know I've just contradicted myself because I said, no thing makes us happy. Happiness isn't found in a what. But when you get a new what, you experience something that is similar to happiness. You experience like a feeling, and it feels warm or nice. If it's a gift that somebody's bought for you, the stuff associated with that makes you feel happy, but maybe that's more about the who. And there's actually something about receiving stuff or having stuff, new things, that we think makes us happy because we confuse what happiness is all about. We think happiness is an emotion, is something that we feel on the inside. And actually, happiness is something far deeper than that. Often what we think happiness is this, but actually it's something far bigger. And as we go throughout this morning, as we go throughout today, this series, hopefully we'll understand a little bit about what true happiness is. Because happiness is more about a who than a what. Happiness is more than an emotion. Happiness is more than that warm, fuzzy feeling that you get inside. And sometimes we confuse happiness with this bunch of endorphins that are stimulating our mind, or a hit of serotonin. Happiness is more than that. Happiness is more than a chemical reaction that you experience in your brain. It goes far deeper. So if we want to understand what it is that makes us happy, well, first we need to understand, what is true happiness? What is it all about? And often we settle for this second-rate version of happiness, or we go after this second-rate version of happiness. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to take a look at the first sermon that's recorded for us that Jesus gave. It's called the Sermon on the Mount because Jesus is standing on the side of a mountain, and he's speaking to a whole bunch of people. Crowds have flocked to him and gathered there, and he says a whole bunch of amazing things. You can find it in Matthew's gospel. That's Matthew's version of the stuff that Jesus said and the things that Jesus did, starting from chapter 5. And Jesus starts this whole sermon about how we live our lives and all these things with stuff about happiness. And this is what Jesus says. Let's dive into it. He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, this word blessed, you can also translate, the Bible's originally written in Greek, and we translate it, or ancient Greek, we translate it into modern English. So often there's words that you can translate in different ways. So some versions of the Bible, some translations will translate it as fortunate are the poor in spirit, or other ones would translate it as happy are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And we often land on blessed because blessed implies something more than happiness. And the reason we think that is because we think happiness is this surface level emotion that we just feel that is here one minute and gone the next. And we think, well, the stuff that Jesus is talking about here is far deeper than our understanding of happiness. But actually, I think what Jesus is saying, well, no, happy are the poor in spirit. The stuff that he's talking about is actually helping us understand what true happiness is all about. The thing about real happiness is it isn't fleeting. It isn't easily influenced. It's not here one minute and gone the next. And God, we learned this last week. We thought about this last week. God wants you to be happy. God isn't there throwing things and challenges and obstacles in your way to destroy your happiness or to make life more difficult for you. God wants you to be happy, but he doesn't want you to settle for surface level superficial happiness. He wants you to encounter and experience and discover true happiness, deep happiness, happiness that transforms us from the inside out. So, as we go through this, perhaps we'll understand a little bit more about what happiness is, but also what is the stuff that God wants for us. And so Jesus is about to give us a list of people who are happy, and the first people in his list are the poor in spirit. Happy are the poor in spirit. And Jesus has just exploded a myth that we know isn't true. We know that happiness isn't to do with money or finance. We know that's not true, but so often we think, actually, if I have more stuff or I have more money, we've talked about this already, then I will be happy. And Jesus is saying, well, no, happy are the poor. But he's talking about more than just financial wealth. He says poor in spirit. Well, what does that mean? What is poor in spirit? Well, I think people who are poor in spirit are aware of the separation between them and God. They're aware of their need for God. They're aware of their shortcomings. They're aware that they fall short of the perfection that God is, and they see the gap between them and God. To use a religious word, people who are poor in spirit are aware of their sin. They're aware of the separation between them and God. And they're also aware that there's nothing that they can do about it. There's nothing they can do to fix the poverty that they have in their spirit. When you come up against God and we see the perfection and the greatness and the majesty of God and we're aware of ourselves, people who are poor in spirit are aware that there's a big gap. And the thing about this is that this is an attitude that affects our actions. It's an attitude that affects our actions. We're going to come back to this time and time again this morning. See, people who are poor in spirit are people who recognize that they're not all that. That they're not perfect. They're aware of their imperfection. They're aware of their selfishness and their self-centeredness. They're aware of their sin, and they're aware of this gap between God and them. And they're also aware and they're able to accept that there is nothing that they can do to solve it. There's nothing they can do to solve or to bridge that gap or to make them better in those things. People who are poor in spirit are completely dependent on God. And we might think, well, that's a bit of a wretched place to be. People who are just aware, well, actually, I'm imperfect, I'm not good enough, and there's nothing that I can do that will make me good enough. Well, that doesn't sound great at all. But Jesus says something amazing about those sort of people who are aware of where they fit in the scheme of things. He says, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, our understanding of success is that successful people don't need anything and are not dependent on anyone. And actually, so much of our lives, we're told, and we do this, we aim for that we want to get to a stage in life where we are self-sufficient, where we don't need anybody and we don't need anything. And we think, actually, if I arrive at that place, well, then I've made it. I'm there, I'm sorted, I've got all my stuff together, I don't need anybody else, I don't really need to rely on anybody else. That's what success in the world around us actually looks like. And Jesus throws this whole thinking on his head. He says, the kingdom of heaven belongs to people, not the people who have it all sorted, not the people who have it all together, not to the people who think they're good enough and you look at and think, well, they just coast through life and they're successful and they're famous and they're powerful and all those sort of things like that. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven does not belong to those sort of people. The kingdom of heaven belongs to the people who don't have it all together and who recognize they don't have it all together and have come to terms with the fact that they don't have it all together and realize that they can't do anything to fix that only God can do that, and they become dependent on him. The funny thing is, we think that the people who have it all together are more likely to find happiness than the people who don't. And Jesus says, well, no, it's different. He's just getting started. Let's jump into the next list. He says, happy are those who mourn, for they will be comforting. And, happy people are people who recognize the randomness of life, that God gives and God takes away, as that old saying goes, that they've come to terms with that you might not like it, might not understand it. There's definitely not anything that we can do about it. But happy people are actually people who are willing to be loved and willing to lose, because they're saying, actually, well, at least I found people and I've received that blessing from people. That happy people are people who are able to confront the challenges and the darkness of death. And sometimes our fear of death and our fear of dying can rob us of the joy of living. Now, they can get in the way of life. And Jesus says, happy are people who mourn. Happy are people who grieve, who come to, who face up to the frailty of life. Because look what happens to them. When you mourn, you're comforted. And we start to discover something about God. We start to discover something about happiness in this. Now, parents out there, what would you do to help your child if they were grieving, if they were upset? What would you do to comfort your child if they were in need? Well, anything. Everything. We would do absolutely everything within our power. We would do anything we could possibly do to bring comfort to our child who's in distress. God does exactly the same. That when we grieve, that when we mourn, that when we experience pain and difficulty, God does absolutely everything he can do, and he's done everything that he can do for us to experience that comfort. But this tells us something about happiness, again, because that doesn't make sense. Well, how can... if you're mourning, you can't be happy because you're sad. And again, we're defaulting to happiness being this emotion. Happiness being something that shows on our face. Happiness is far deeper than that. You can experience true happiness in the midst of pain. You can experience true happiness in the midst of grief and distress. And it tells us something about God, that God is not absent in the midst of our pain. God is not absent in the midst of our grief. That he's there with us. He's there comforting us and supporting us and helping us. And actually, that's what helps us discover this happiness. That in the midst of this pain, there's somebody who understands. There's somebody who intercedes for us to God. There's somebody who stands with us and supports us and offers us comfort. And it's God himself. Well, that helps us understand and discover a little bit more about what happiness is. Let's carry on. Happy are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. I like that one because the meek don't tend to get a lot. Meek, to be meek means, you're gentle, that you're humble. This isn't about thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. It's not about having yourself in the center all the time. People who are meek don't think that the world revolves around them, that God doesn't exist to serve them. Actually, when you live like that, when you think the world is there to serve you, that God's there to serve you, that you're the center of the universe and everything revolves around you, you'd never say that out loud. But actually, when you look at your attitudes, when you look at your actions, it might speak to that actually you really, think through what you say and what you do, that you are the center of the universe, and when difficulty happens, God is there to solve that problem for you, not just comfort you, but to solve all of those things. It's exhausting living like that because life isn't like that. When things go wrong, we think the world is falling apart because, well, actually, everything isn't comfortable for me, that I'm facing this difficulty or this challenge. And when we think we're the center of the universe, when God doesn't do what we want him to do, well, we start to think, well, maybe God isn't there because he's not done what I want him to do. And because I'm facing this difficulty, God can't exist, because obviously God exists to serve me and to make my life more comfortable and to make my life easier. That's what it's like. It's exhausting. If you think you are the center of the universe, you will never find happiness. But meek people have a different outlook. They have an attitude that affects their actions. And it's actually an attitude that runs against the default operating system of the world. People who always put themselves at the center are not happy. And Jesus says something amazing about the humble, about the gentle, about the people who recognize actually the world doesn't revolve around them. He says something amazing about the people who recognize where they fit in the grand scheme of things, that it's not all about them. He says they will inherit the earth. And it's a strange thing because actually the people who think they are the center of all things, actually the very thing that they're after is given to the people who are willing to let it go. Happy are the people who are humble, who are gentle. Happy are the people who recognize that the world isn't there to serve them and it's not all about them, because they will inherit the earth. There's a bunch more to go through, so we're going to pick up the pace for the rest of the list. Happy are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. This is about people who seek what is right and to be in a right relationship with others. People who do that, who hunger and thirst for what is right, will find fulfillment in life. People, they're not after vengeance. They're not after retribution. They're not after about getting even. They're not even after about getting what's owed for them. They hunger and they thirst for what is right, and they will be filled. They find fulfillment in life. They discover that there's more to life than what we see. Happy are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Happy are people who are willing to give other people some slack, who recognize that we're not perfect, that we make mistakes, that we get it wrong sometimes, and are willing to extend mercy and grace to people, just as that grace and mercy has been extended to them. Happy are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Now, pure or purity, that's a word that's going out of fashion in our world. But it's something that brings us happiness. And you know this. When you do stuff that makes you feel the opposite of pure, when you do stuff or think stuff or say stuff that makes you feel impure, you don't feel happy. And actually, you feel far from God in those moments. Not because of that poor in spirit stuff necessarily, but actually you're just aware of your depravity. Maybe that's not something you talk about. Talk about that over lunch. Your depravity, and all of those sort of things. Your impurity. When that stuff there, actually we feel far from God. But purity does the opposite. Being pure in heart helps us see God. It gives that clarity about who God is, and it brings that connection to God. That tells us something about happiness, is that when there's a separation from God, we can't discover what true happiness is. When we're separated from God, we can't have that happiness. But when we can see God and we're connected to God, we can find what happiness is all about. Happy are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Have you ever met a happy troublemaker? No, of course you haven't. Peacemakers are reconcilers. They're people who go out of their way to restore relationships. Peacemakers are people who don't wait for the other person to make the first move. And I'm sure we all know at least one person who's experienced a broken relationship and is not doing anything about it. Something's happened and somebody said something, and probably nobody knows how it started in the first place. And now it's got to a point where the relationship is damaged. And they say things like, well, I will apologize, but when they apologize first. They wait for the other person to make the first move. And funnily enough, happy is not a word we would use to describe people like that. We'd probably say something more like bitter. That's what those people are like. Happy are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And, let me let you into a secret that you already know. You're going to suffer in life. That's my word of hope and encouragement to you this morning. You are going to suffer. There are going to be times when life is difficult and life is hard. You're going to find persecution in those sort of things. You can't escape it. You can't choose that. It comes with the heartbeat. But what you can choose is about whether you will suffer for doing what is right or whether you will suffer for doing what is wrong. You can be happy on one side of this equation, but not the other. Happy are those who are persecuted because of right things. Happy are those who face difficulty and hardship because they're going after, being in a right relationship or restoring or reconciling, that they discover something. You can't choose that. You can't choose whether you experience this or not, but you can choose whether you do it for what's right or for what happens for what's wrong. So let's just take a quick look at Jesus' happy list. This is his happy list. This is what Jesus is saying, that these people are happy. This is what they receive. And, if before we started, I was to give you a pen and paper and say, just write a list of categories or descriptions of happy people or characteristics, I wonder how many of us would include things like this. They actually tend to run counterclockwise. They tend to run contrary to what we think or the default operating system of the world is around us. All of these things, this is our phrase, are attitudes that affect our actions. All of these things that Jesus is talking about is an attitude, something that's going on in our head that actually influences what we do, what we think, what we say, how we interact with other people. And it's through those things, it's through getting our attitudes right and allowing it to influence our actions that we can actually discover happiness, or the opposite. They influence how we see ourselves. They influence how we see God. They influence how we see the world and the people around us. But, Jesus' happy list tells us a bunch of other stuff about happiness. It tells us that happiness is an outcome. Happiness is an outcome. It isn't something that is fleeting. It isn't something that's easily influenced by a shiny new thing. Happiness is an outcome of our attitudes. It's an outcome of our actions. And, again, this tells us something else about happiness. Happiness is not instantly attainable. You cannot click your fingers and just be happy. You cannot go out and buy something. We've talked about that so many times, and discover happiness. Happiness is far more than that. Happiness is far deeper than that. You sow and you reap your way to happiness. You plan for happiness. It's an outcome. And when we start to understand these sort of things, we see happiness is far deeper than what we first thought it to be. And it's not something that is just easily influenced. It's not something that just happens. It's not something that's here and gone in a moment. Actually, happiness is a result of how we orientate our lives. Happiness is a result of the attitudes that we have, our attitudes towards God, our attitudes towards the world and the people around us, the attitudes that we have towards ourselves. And when we get that right, when we allow those attitudes to affect our actions, we start to sow and reap our way to happiness. Happiness is forged. It's not found. And so this is the beginning of this sermon, this famous sermon that Jesus speaks. And I encourage you to read it. It's only a couple of chapters. And you'll see that actually a lot of the stuff that Jesus is talking about is attitudes and actions. And he starts with the Beatitudes. That's what this called, this list of things. And it ends with something else. It ends with something that we are all familiar with. Whether you've been in church for ages or this is your first time in church, whether you've read the Bible from cover to cover or you've never picked it up, chances are you know this. Chances are you are familiar with what Jesus says next at the end of the sermon. So you can picture the scene. He's talked about a whole bunch of things. He's talked about relationships. He's talked about attitudes. He's talked about actions. And he brings all of this to a close with this famous parable, this famous story about a wise and a foolish builder. You know this. You might remember singing the song, if you're at a certain age of those sort of things. If you're younger than that, you're like, what on earth is that? You're doing the Macarena? Let's get on this. And what Jesus is saying is he's talking about two builders. And he says, there's a foolish builder. And the foolish builder built his house. Well, where did the foolish builder build his house? On the sand. You're with me. That's excellent. He built his house on the sand. And why would you build your house on the sand? Well, he built a house on the sand because it was quick. It was the easy option to do that. It was the cheapest option. You don't have to do all the heavy labor, all the stuff, just build it up. And everyone listening to the story of Jesus was saying, well, that's ridiculous because nobody builds a house on the sand. It's crazy because as soon as a storm rolls in, what's going to happen to the house? It's going to fall flat. Should we do the action? There you go. It's going to fall flat. That's exactly what's going to happen. You know the song. You know the story. And this is what happened. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. And he goes up quickly. It's easy. It's cheap. It's not as expensive. But a storm rolls in. The wind beats against the house. And the rains come down. The floods come up. It's taking me back. And the house that he built fall flat. And nobody's surprised by that. Nobody is there sitting there listening to Jesus like, oh, wow. I didn't see, did you see that coming? No, of course that's going to happen. But the wise builder doesn't build his house on the sand. The wise builder takes a different option, and this one is more costly. This one is more time-consuming. He builds his house on the what? on the rock, on the hard surface. He has to like put foundations in and all of those sorts of stuff. It takes longer. It's more costly. But when the rains come in and the floods come up and all of that stuff, when the wind beats against this house, I'm confusing it now with the three little pigs, so I'll huff and I'll puff, and I'll blow your house down. You know, the house stands firm. Why? Well, because it's built on a solid foundation. Yes, it took more time, certainly took more money, took more energy and all of those things, but the house stands firm. Now, Jesus tells us this story. We love it and all those sort of things. We sing the songs, we got the actions, but what does it mean? Well, Jesus says this. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, what words? Well, excuse me, I think we could apply it to any words of Jesus, but in this original context, he's talking about this Sermon on the Mount, this happy list, but all these other things about your attitudes and your actions. He says, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who builds his house on the rock. You know, this isn't rocket science, it's basic engineering. He says that when you do this, when you apply this stuff, when life happens and the storm of life rolls in, everything doesn't crash down around you. You know, actually, you stay standing and your life stays standing. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. Because when life happens, when stuff happens, when those things that Jesus has talked about throughout this sermon just come, when people throw things at you and life is just difficult, everything comes crashing down because you think you're the center of the universe. You haven't got that foundation. Your attitude isn't right. Your actions certainly are not right. And there you go. It all comes crashing down. Jesus says, wise people are people who listen to me and put the stuff into practice. They don't just listen and say, oh, that was nice. That was interesting. That's great. What should we have for tea? They listen and they allow what they hear or what they read or what they discover to influence their attitudes, which changes their actions. And actually, they put this stuff in practice. And their house is built on the rock. But people who hear that stuff and then just carry on through like cooking eggs, you know, ignoring, you know, the stuff. So, oh, that's interesting. Let's talk about that. What did Jesus really mean? You know, and actually you could do this through deep theology and delve into it. And, well, actually the Greek word here means this and all of those sort of things. And spend all that time discussing it. But then over here, don't actually do anything about it. Don't allow it to change how they think, how they see themselves, how they see the world around them. Certainly doesn't change their actions. Well, Jesus says, you're a fool. You're a fool to do that. You are like a guy who builds his house on the sand. How crazy is that? Which one of these is happier in the end is an obvious question. You know, it's an attitude that affects our actions, how we see ourselves and how we see the world around us. So let's go back to this happy list. And just take a look at these sort of characteristics, I can't say that word. Which one of these describe you? You know, which of these things that Jesus says, look, these are what happy people are. You know, just give yourself I'm meek. Yeah, I'm humble. It's my best assets. You know, I'm really proud of my humility. Or I might be losing it here. You know, which ones describe you? Which ones are far from you? You think, actually, that's not me. This is stuff that I need to work on. You know, Jesus says, this is what happiness looks like. Or this is what happy people look like. You know, what's God saying to you in this? What's Jesus saying to you? He says, you know, the wise man or the wise person is the person who hears this and puts it into practice. Because when life happens, life continues. You know, their faith continues and things don't come crashing down. But foolish people are people who hear this and then just ignore it and don't actually do anything with it or don't change anything with it. Because when life rolls in, everything comes crashing down. And this is challenging because as I look at that list and I think about myself, I think, wow, my word. You know, am I a peacemaker? Do I have that humility? Am I poor in spirit? Do I have that dependency on God? It's not just this list of stuff. You know, let's read through the whole of the sermon that Jesus said. Let's look at the things that Jesus said and the things that Jesus did and see, actually, are we applying them? You know, we may know them. You know, if you've been following Jesus for many years, you've probably read all of the Gospels so many times that you could recite it off by heart, but just because it's in your head doesn't necessarily mean anything. Is it in your heart? Are you muting me? There we go. Are we affecting the way that we listen, the way that we live our lives? Because Jesus says, when you do this, you discover that. Let's get the band back up as we wrap up our time together. If you're really honest, and you think about your list, what would your list be there? What are your attitudes? What are your actions? And how well is that doing at making you happy? You've lived your entire life in this way, and you've, let me just poke you or prod you for a moment. Maybe you've tried thinking this or living like this or acting this way that is different from this, and it's not working. It's why you're not happy. Deep down, your happiness is superficial. It's here 1 minute and it's gone the next. It's influenced or it's impacted by what people say or what people think. It's impacted by what people give to you. If that's your happiness, if your happiness is here 1 minute and it's gone the next, you are not living in the fullness of happiness that God has for you. And Jesus says, look, this is what happy people are. This is what happy people look like. And this is what happy people receive. What is your way doing? You've done it and it's not working. So why not try Jesus' way? Your way doesn't work. You know that. Why not try Jesus' way? What have you got to lose? What have you got to gain? This happy list is about allowing the words of Jesus to influence what we think, to influence how we see ourselves, to influence how we see God, to influence how we see the world and the people around us. And then through that, allowing a so what, that actually we do something different. We live differently. And when we do that, we discover what true happiness is all about. Let me pray for you. Why don't we stand to our feet as we start to wrap up our time together? Father God, I thank you so much that you want us to experience happiness, that you want us to experience fullness of life. Father, I thank you that the happiness that you have for us is far deeper and far greater than the ones that we often settle for. Challenge us, encourage us, and equip us to be people who go after you and pursue you and put these things into practice. And as we do that, Lord, I pray that you'd meet us. I pray that you'd help us, that you'd encourage us, that you'd comfort us, and you'd help us to be truly happy. Thank you, Lord. Amen.